All right, welcome to Halitics. I'm Hal Ginsberg. So glad to talk to you today. It is Thursday, the 15th, and short week for me. Just 3 live streams, 3 podcasts this week, and then a full week next week. We do have Arlen coming on. And by the way, sorry for that hair there. I got to get my hair cut. This is a problem. It gets unruly. Apologize. I never look at myself in the mirror, so I don't know what I'm going to look like for you guys until I actually am broadcasting. And then it's too late, so hey, if you don't like the way I look, then I guess you can just stop looking at your screen and just listen. That'll do for me. Don't forget, please do click like and subscribe. Got to get those numbers. I mean, they just trickle. What is the word I'm looking for? Trickle, ticking up very, very slowly. I think I do a good show. I've been watching other podcasters, and we have sort of a little cadre of I would call truly progressives. Headed maybe by Due Dissidents and Brianna Joy Gray, and then myself. I really don't see anyone else out there whose politics are as similar to my own. I certainly don't think Jimmy Dore is anymore. Brianna Joy Gray probably the closest. The Due Dissidents boys, they're not so into the Green Party as I am. I understand their skepticism. They really, especially Keaton. I don't know about Russell as much, but Keaton seems pretty down on the Green Party because it could not get on the ballot. Jill Stein won't be on the ballot in New York State. And I understand that, but hey, we did our best. It's very, very tough. The rules are all written by and for the duopoly. They've rigged everything against any challenges to them. And, I understand the argument, which is, hey, we have a winner-take-all system. So if we allow parties like the Libertarians, who invariably are on the ballot, but the Green Party as well, then we're helping the other party, right? If you're if you consider the Republicans and the Libertarians on the right, the Libertarians probably are more likely to take votes from the Republican candidate, and obviously the Green Party is more likely to take votes from the Democrat. I do think in 2000, Al Gore lost the Electoral College because of Ralph Nader. And I personally will never forgive Ralph Nader for that. People will say, well, Hal, you're such a hypocrite. How can you possibly say that? How can you criticize Ralph Nader for arguably taking down Gore when you voted for Jill Stein in 2016 and you're talking her up in this election season as well? My answer is because Al Gore was actually a pretty decent candidate. Al Gore was clearly correct when it came to the climate cataclysm. He was one of the early adopters of policies that would curb our consumption of fossil fuels. Obviously, the Democratic Party moved in a very different direction as of 2008 with Obama. And also because, we were pretty much at peace in 2000. And it was clear that W was the candidate of the mic. And he led us into a terrible, terrible war that's been endless in the Middle East. So I feel very, very comfortable that we would be in a much better place had Ralph Nader not ran for president, not run for president in 2000. But this is a different situation. 2016, we had 2 terrible candidates. They were both really bad. There was no good option between Trump and Clinton, only 2 very bad ones. And that's similar to the situation, I believe, right now. If you believe, as I do, and I don't know how really anyone could have a different view, if you agree that the genocide by Israel with our full support is one of the most moral issues we've ever seen as a nation. It's right up there with ultimately not as serious, right? Because we had slavery, we had this terrible crime against humanity that was ongoing right on our shores for hundreds of years. We were eradicating the indigenous population for hundreds of years right on our shores. So those have to take precedence as more important moral issues, moral imperatives, which we didn't stop, right? Well, we did ultimately stop slavery. But we are fully behind. We are responsible for genocide right now. And I don't think one can vote for, a candidate who isn't prepared to say this is wrong. We must stop it. And we don't have that candidate this election cycle. At least we don't yet. Now, maybe we will, but we don't as of now. So that's the difference, right? That's the difference between 2024 and 2000. That's the difference between Jill Stein, who is morally correct, who is on solid moral grounds, and Ralph Nader, who was kind of a vanity candidate, didn't really have an issue. 2000. I don't even remember, was he for Medicare for all? I assume he was. I mean, that was a critical issue. I don't remember that. I could be wrong. So today's program, will history repeat itself in Chicago? The Democratic convention starting this Monday in Chicago. And, the Democrats want, obviously, you can understand, they want a good show. They want to give Kamala a big boost and keep the pressure on Trump, who is now behind, who's clearly now not the front runner. It is Kamala Harris's race to lose, and the Democrats don't want to do anything to jeopardize that. They just want a no fuss, no muss, drama-free 3 or 4 days in Chicago. Doesn't look necessarily like that's going to happen. There are pro-Palestine, anti-genocide protesters who've made it clear that they want to have their voices heard. They want their issue addressed in Chicago next week, and we'll see how that plays out. Before we talk about that, that's going to be a main focus. Also, I'm going to get to Ukraine. There's that offensive, right? Actually, it's in Russia now. Some of the fighting in the Russia-Ukraine theater is now actually on Russian territory. That hasn't been the case since maybe very, very early in this latest war. So we'll talk about that maybe towards the end of the program, but let's start where we invariably do, the terrible, terrible circumstances in Gaza. And this is the worst place on earth, in other words. Most likely to die. You're most likely to be killed as if you're in Gaza right now. Killed by enemy, Israel, a genocidal enemy, Israel, or, directly bombs, guns, or starvation, disease. Deaths now over 40,000, 40,005. The killing just doesn't end. Israel's murderous orgy just doesn't stop. And I know there's been a lot of talk about ceasefire. I'll believe it when I see it. I'm not going to get excited about it. Apparently, well, at least the New York Times, I think, is reporting, maybe it was the Washington Post, that Hamas has basically said, we don't want to talk anymore. We're done. And I understand that. I get why they would say it, because Israel's been such a bad faith actor, and they don't trust the U.S. to be a good faith broker. Of course, why should they? I mean, we're supplying. We're responsible for what's happening, largely, not primarily, but largely responsible for the murders, the killing, the genocide, as we are supplying the weaponry. Just in the past 24 hours, we saw the official death count from the Palestinian Ministry surpass 40,000. Last 24 hours, 40 Palestinians reported killed at a minimum, over 100 injured. So that's the latest horrible news, horrific news, the latest that we're behind, that we're helping, we're promoting. It's killings. And we could stop it. We could just say, we're not going to give you any more weapons. We're done. Heck, we could send our armies in to protect Palestine. And that's what we should do. To Chicago, to the Windy City, which is a nice city. I was there last year, enjoyed it very much. Pro-Palestine protesters vow massive showing. They say replacement of Joe Biden with Harris doesn't affect their plans for a show of anger and dissent. And why would it? I mean, we're not seeing any commitment from Harris to change policies. We haven't heard Harris express empathy, concern for the victims of the Israeli onslaught. So why would they change their plans? Just a few days ago, I referred to this yesterday. I just want to bring it up again because this explains for those of you who say, well, but Trump is worse. Trump is more awful. Why would those Palestinians even think about protesting Harris? She's even said there should be a ceasefire. Apparently so is Trump, by the way. I don't have that information, but according to Breaking Points, that's the Crystal Ball, Sagar, and Jetty program. According to their I think it's their most recent, I don't have the video here, Crystal Ball and Ryan Grimm from The Intercept reporting that Trump has also called on Israel now to accept the ceasefire terms that are being pushed by the United States, Qatar. According to Breaking Points, and my understanding as well, Hamas has agreed to. 5 days ago, while hopes were sort of high that there could possibly be a ceasefire, 100 were killed by Israel at a school being bombed. That's a Boeing bomb. That was confirmed. That was a Boeing bomb on August 10th. So again, why wouldn't pro-Palestine, I call them anti-genocide. Why wouldn't anti-genocide protesters be at the convention? Of course they would. The only pressure point to stop Israel is the United States. We have the power. Would Kamala use it to stop the killing? So far, the answer is a resounding and incredibly disappointing no. There's a fear among the establishment here in Washington, D.C., among the, quote, liberal, unquote, establishment among the. There's a real fear that Donald Trump could get reelected. And what I always say to people who express that fear, yes, Trump's awful. I get it. It would be really bad if Trump gets reelected. But don't be so distraught. Don't be so down and out. Don't be so downbeat or downcast about a possible Trump win, because it's not like if the Democrats win, things would be a lot better. It's not like Trump is all that much worse. He is rhetorically worse on Israel, although again, Breaking Points reports he's called Bibi and said, hey, take the ceasefire, stop it. That's what they're saying. I don't know if it's true. But there's a terrible fear. And you can see Colbert King here. He's, I guess, the grand old man of the Washington Post editorial page. Been there at least since the 80s, so we're looking at 40 plus years. And that's a relatively recent picture. They've updated it. You can see he looks kind of wizened in that picture. I don't know how old he is. I'm going to guess late 70s. I'll look that up for you a second. But King says, hey, we can't let Chicago happen again, 68. Can't have a redux, can't see, rioting in the streets and people, internal fighting, delegates yelling at each other. We can't have that. We need to be united. No more disastrous gatherings. And I don't know, I assume he didn't write that headline, but the headline is completely belied by the text. King doesn't suggest at all in his writing that Harris has the power to prevent a rerun of 68. He doesn't put the burden on her. He doesn't put the onus on the Democrats to adopt pro-people, pro-peace policies that would be popular, at least among Democrats, at least among Democratic activists, although not Democratic funders. He doesn't say that at all. He tells protesters, activists, pro-peace Americans, hey, careful, don't push too hard, don't be too aggressive, don't whine too much, don't complain too much, don't be too active, because oh my gosh, well, we could get Trump. And if we got Trump, well, the genocide will continue, just like it's going to continue under Harris, apparently. That seems to be King's position. I don't agree with that position. 240-242-5646. If democracy means anything, it means we can demand better from our leaders. It means we can demand some kind of morality in our government. It means we can say, hey, we really didn't even get to choose Kamala to be the representative of one of the parties. She was imposed on us by elites. So we're not happy about it, and we're going to register our displeasure. If democracy means anything, that's what it means. So the idea that we're supposed to stand down and accept, by all appearances, by all evidence, another pro-genocide Democrat, no, I'm not there. I do think there's things the Democrats can do, they should do, they could do, but we talked about this yesterday, they come with a risk. All right, let's get to the specifics of King's piece. I like Colbert. I always thought he's a good writer. He's certainly more, I think he's less knee-jerk in his responses often. But ultimately, he is part and parcel of the Washington Post corporate media elite. He's on TV a lot. I mean, I don't know what his salary is. I'm guessing he makes over $500,000 a year to spout opinions. I mean, that's a great job if you can get it. I've got the job, except I don't have the money. From King, many pro-Palestine or pro-Palestinian protesters plan, boy, say that 5 times, pro-Palestinian protesters plan to descend on Chicago next week in large numbers. And according to one activist, this is the equivalent of the 68 DNC in Chicago. Today's Democrats could hardly want a repeat of that debacle. But we're going to hear also later on, there was a really cool Eyewitness 7 piece about 2 minutes from Chicago that talks about that convention just recently. It's a really interesting video. I want to get to it, but let's focus right now on what King has to say and what his prescription for the pro-Palestinian protests is, what his prescription is to respond to it. First, he gives you the horribles. This is how awful it was back in '68. Thousands of anti-war activists arrived where Mayor Daley said, these people are terrorists, and you've probably seen the video of him shaking his fists at Abe Ribicoff, who decried on the floor of the convention Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. And they were. You could see the police bashing protesters over the head with their nightsticks, kicking people. This was Gestapo tactics. Ribicoff had a very, very fair point. I think it was Abe Ribicoff, wasn't it? I believe so. Look that up in a sec. So my thought is, okay, good for you, King. You're centering the police violence, which was the biggest issue. That's what made the party look worse than anything else, was that police violence in the streets. The mayor, Daley, a Democrat, so it's not like it was a Republican mayor who was making things, worse, who was rat-effing things up. You'd think King would say, okay, first and foremost, let's make sure that Chicago PD doesn't act out, doesn't crack skulls, doesn't beat the crap out of people. Let's make sure that the protesters have a venue, have a place where they can make their voices heard, where there is some democracy, seeing the Democratic Party is seen as open to voices that aren't consistent with the policies that they pursued. And that's nowhere to be found. Doesn't that seem like the obvious answer? First and foremost, if you're king and you hate Trump and you don't want Trump to get reelected, and your newspaper clearly is on the Clinton side, or sorry, not Clinton, the Kamala Harris side of this, wouldn't the first order of business be, hey, let's not have the violence. That's what we don't want. And who was responsible? Well, obviously the violence was instigated by the police. But that's not where King goes. King talks about how the protesters, by their actions, really screwed up the party, really hurt the possibility, made it more difficult, and ultimately prevented Hubert Humphrey from becoming president. A man who ultimately probably would have ended the Vietnam War much, much sooner than Nixon, who, as King points out, made things much, much worse, right? He and Kissinger started bombing Cambodia, probably killing another 3 million people, and the war went on, until 73, 75, something like that. So again, King says pro-peace protests in 68, ironically, at the convention, may have prolonged the, almost assuming that they were the difference, right? They were the reason for Nixon to win. They, ironically, those who were most against the war and who went into the convention to stop it if they possibly could, ultimately may have prolonged it, led to more deaths, more killing. Well, I guess that there's an argument there. But is it the protesters' fault, or is it the police fault? Assuming that it was indeed those protests that led to the Democrats losing to Nixon. And of course, Nixon lied, because he said he had a secret plan to end the war. He campaigned to say, hey, I'm going to end the war. It wasn't true. He prolonged it. He made it worse. But he said, he campaigned to a degree as pro-peace. Maybe that's what the Democrats should have done. Maybe the Democrats should have said, no, we're really committed to ending this war. But they didn't. And that was the problem. Along with the fact that the police instigated the violence. War went on until 75. Another 7+ years. King, though, doesn't blame the Democrats, doesn't blame the police. It's those pesky protesters who are to blame, according to King. And he points out, hey, since those protests are a good argument can be made that the protests led us to a Nixon administration and all that entailed, Kent State. I mean, there's so many awful things out of Nixon. Kent State, Chile, and Pinochet, where a Democratic president was assassinated, Allende, and a tyrant, a murderous tyrant, took over. And then Watergate. So obviously, we don't want another Nixon. And that's who Trump is by extension, according to King. Now, I guess that's fair, right? I mean, Trump's really bad. We don't want another Trump. So according to King, the last thing the protesters should do, because it would be on them, the last thing the protesters should do is tear up the convention and cause more disarray and drag down Harris and make a second Trump administration happen. Well, listen, the problem in the Democratic Party is that it supports genocide. The problem in the Democratic Party is that it silences pro-peace voices. The problem in the Democratic Party is that corporate elites are driving the bus. And they're not even listening to the passengers who are saying, we don't want to go in this direction. So King gets it completely wrong. Here's, again, it's the protesters' fault. Sit down, shut up, don't complain. Because alternative-wise, you'll get Trump. It's odd because the title of this piece is a rerun of Chicago only if Harris lets it happen. And yet, it appears that the people who King insists could cause a repeat aren't Harris at all, is the protesters. It's all on the protesters. It's all on the people who hate what we're doing, hate our policy, hate the fact that we're killing through, Israel, through our proxy, through our closest ally, thousands and thousands and thousands of Palestinians. So it's odd to me that King says, hey, Harris would be the one who lets it happen. But he doesn't give any suggestion. It's all, well, the protesters just have to stand down. It's not even the police. The police just shouldn't be knocking heads. None of that. Just the protesters. Sit down, shut up, don't complain. Otherwise, you fuel disarray, you drag down Harris, and you make things worse. Things are going to be as bad as they are, and there's nothing you can do. The only thing you can do is make it worse. The last paragraph, finally, and this just shows you we don't have any kind of democratic with a small d media. We don't have newspapers that are championing the people, that are saying, no, we've had enough of political parties bought and paid for by corporate elites. But why, and why would the Washington Post ever adopt the pro-democratic with a small d policy? Why would it? It's owned by the richest man, or I don't know, who's richer, Musk or Bezos? I don't know, one or the other. Things are hunky-dory if you're Jeff Bezos. Things are just great. We love the Democratic Party. The one piece of advice that Colbert King tells Kamala Harris when he says, you can't let there be another Chicago 68. Don't let your campaign morph into infomercials for causes. And I was trying to understand, well, what is that? Like, I mean, I'm trying to parse that because I really don't even, my assumption, I think what he's trying to say there is, don't allow your concern for the Palestinian people. Don't allow your understandable, who knows if she really has it, but he's saying, hey, if you are understandably empathic when it comes to the 40,000 dead and the 100,000+ wounded and the millions in Gaza who are at risk of death, don't let that sway you. Don't let those protesters convince you that the party needs to change. No infomercials. We're not going to do a 2-minute segment on how we shouldn't be helping Israel. Don't do that, because if you do that, that's how we'll lose. Which is odd, because the reason the Democrats lost in '68 is because they had a violent, at least according to King, in King's telling, a violent convention, riots, in disarray, and people were turned off and said, I can't support this. And all of that was because of the Vietnam War. So you'd think King might say, well, we shouldn't be supporting the killing in Gaza. We shouldn't be supporting Israel. We need to pull back on that policy. But no, he's like, no. We're just going to keep on keeping on. Hakuna Matata. And here's where I'll say what you may find surprising. I don't necessarily think on the narrow question of what's best for Kamala Harris to get elected, King is wrong. If Harris came out forcibly for the Palestinians and forcibly against Israel, as morally correct as she would be putting many votes at risk. There are many so-called liberal Jews and so-called liberal Zionists who aren't Jewish who might gravitate to Trump or stay home. And that's tragic. That's so unfortunate. And right now, the nation is very evenly split. She has a little bit of an advantage for sure, but it's not such a big advantage that she can jeopardize losing maybe millions of votes. Plus, getting the full-throated opposition of AIPAC and other pro-Israel groups. Ultimately, this tells you why the Democratic Party's policy, why its drift right, its adoption of corporate policies past 40 years. And remember what Obama said, how Reagan was a transformative president? He was transformative because he basically, well, the Republican Party always was a party of corporate elites. But he was transformative in that he transformed government. So government itself became an extension of the corporate state. And Obama was good with that. He's like, hey, look at that, a transformative president. I want to make the Democratic Party as solidly an arm, as much an appendage of Wall Street and the mic as Reagan. And by the way, really what Obama did is just continue the same transformation that Bill Clinton had. Bill Clinton, the economy's stupid. We're never going to take on corporations. We're going to do what they want. We're going to do what our donors want. Robert Reich dressed down, silenced by what's the guy, the Skeletor, James Carville, because one time he said, I don't think we should be siding with Wall Street here. We should side with workers. He said that on meeting, and Carville just told them later, don't ever be fired. So we see that because the Democrats adopted identity politics, identify, slice, and dice politics, pitting working people against each other, taking the money from corporations every opportunity they could, working people don't trust them. Working people recognize that they've been betrayed at every opportunity. They see two parties that both view them as expendable, who couldn't care less about them. And as a result, there's no loyalty. If you have to be constantly mindful, will this policy alienate this group? Will this policy alienate, and often very small groups, right? There aren't that many people who care that much about Israel. But some care really, really, and the people who do really care about Israel also are generally very rich. The Democratic Party can't afford to lose those voters and lose their financial support, or at least that's what it thinks. The Democrats have been fighting for workers for the past 40 years. If Obama had pushed through a public option with the understanding that we were going to move forward towards Medicare for all, if he had campaigned and said, we need more Democrats so every American has health care from cradle to grave, you know what? The Democratic Party would have a lot more goodwill. It would enjoy a lot more positive vibes from working people. And it wouldn't be in such grave danger of losing every election if it alienates one relatively well or one extremely rich, but not particularly large in terms of population group. If the Democratic Party had championed good jobs for Americans, had opposed free trade deals, if they had demanded that public education be truly affordable for every single American, they wouldn't be in this pickle. They wouldn't have their head between a stake where they don't know which way to turn, where whatever they do, they risk losing an election. But because the Democrat Party embraced corporate elites, they have very narrow margins of victory. And that's why Albert King is saying, don't. Those wealthy donors, those pro-Israel donors, piss them off. Will 68 repeat itself? I don't think it will. There's a really cool video. I want to play this for you now. By the way, if you want to join me, 240-242-5646. I'm not checking the chat, sorry. Got a lot on my mind right now. Don't really have time for that. But I do want you to see this video. Well, at least I found it really, really interesting. So I want to get it up. And the people who actually participated, okay, so this is back in 68. And they're saying, and I think very persuasively as far as I'm concerned, why they don't think we're looking at another 68. Because remember, 68 was driven in large part by the police violence, something that King kind of elides. He passes over it. He just sort of says violence erupted, violence happened. He doesn't really, he minimizes or doesn't even mention how it was the police themselves responsible for the violence. Here we go. Let's go back to 68 in Chicago.
All political conventions come with protests, but nothing compares to 1968 here in Chicago.
It was a big rally. Let's say maybe 8,000 people were there, and they were ringed by police with riot gear and helmets.
Craig Sauter was about to begin his senior year at Indiana.
I'm just going to stop there for a sec because you see the blinking. I had trouble with that. I think that's the video itself. That blinking will stop in a moment.
Indiana University when he drove to Chicago to join the protests against the Vietnam War.
As I came over the Skyway, I saw line after line of troops, some Army troops lined up out there, and I said to myself, this is going to be a wild day.
But Don Rose says it didn't have to be a wild day had the city worked with the activists to get permits to protest peacefully within eyeshot of the convention.
Mayor Daley, the original, Richard Shea, thought we were all bad guys and scum.
Don Rose was the press spokesman for the National Mobilization Committee to End the War, the main group organizing the protests. Rose coined the phrase, "The whole world is watching," as the Law and Order Daily unleashed Chicago police on the
exactly
protesters.
What I was talking about. The police creating the scenes of violence. And if King were really concerned about a repeat, then he would be saying the problem is overly aggressive policing. The problem was then overly aggressive policing. The problem then was a Democratic Party that was not listening to pro-peace voices. But King isn't ultimately concerned with some kind of protection for democratic activists, for democracy. He simply wants to get Kamala Harris elected.
Command is given to clear the streets, and that's when the police just wade in with billy clubs and tear gas, and people are fighting back, and people are throwing stuff, and it's just total chaos.
With pro-Palestinian protests planned next week during the Democratic convention, Sauter and Rose say the circumstances are much different to expect any type of repeat of 1968.
The police are much more disciplined and better trained.
And with thousands of American soldiers killed in Vietnam, the cause for the 1968 protests affected Americans directly. It also divided the Democratic Party.
The convention was divided against itself, and people were at war within families. Adults were for the war in Vietnam, and the kids were against it.
Despite next week's planned protests, Sauter and Rose predict that the 2024 Democratic National Convention will be like most others, just a big pep rally for the nominee. Sarah Schulte, ABC 7 Eyewitness News.
Yeah, so I think that's the bottom line, and correct response is just going to be a pep rally. I don't think King needs to worry so much about it. I worry about it because I worry about our very steady erosion of freedoms, how they're being lost. And as bad as things were in 68, did have protests that were visible, that were seen, that were heard. You didn't get an advertisement for the Democratic Party. But I'd like to see at this convention, not police beating people up, but I want to see lines of protesters. I want to hear chants. I want to hear the Democratic Party acknowledge the pain that its policies are causing. That no, of course not. All right, before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about, I will get to in a moment, I will get to in a minute the termination of the services of President Minu Shafik of Columbia University. She is the very pro-Zionist, anti-protester president, and the very interesting responses to it. This is actually from Jewish Insider magazine, or newspaper. But before we do that, I just want to play a clip here, because every now and then I like to just show that my views, are at least somewhat mainstream, or at least adopted by others. So I was taken. I prepared my program. I got all the clips from the Colbert King piece, and then I looked at breaking points where they discussed it in part. They talked about the DNC 2024 as well. And I was taken by what Crystal Ball had to say about King's piece. So let me play that for you. All right, let me jump forward because, of course, it's not starting. Oh, you can see me sliding. Let me see if I can get over to about 15. I thought it was going to start right where I wanted. Fortunately, I think so, right around here. Let's see.
A ceasefire deal. Even they are pushing him, which suggests that there's some structural interest that.
All right, so what Grim is saying, there's something I mentioned earlier, that even Trump is pushing for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. He's pushing Israel to have a ceasefire with Hamas. And that's kind of belies what Colbert King said. Because Colbert King said if the Democrats become pro-Palestine, then all the pro-Israel voters will go right over to Trump. But Ryan Grimm's saying, hey, Trump has also signaled a desire for some kind of a ceasefire and for Israel to agree to the terms. So let's continue that.
The U.S. has that is diverging from Israel's at this point, which is the one thing that gives me some optimism that perhaps this is going to move forward. Because at the end of the day, Israel is a tiny country and it is a client of the United States. And the United States has major interests that it may feel are being undermined. And it may believe that Iran, China, and Russia are all objectively becoming more powerful as a result of this flailing that we're doing in the region.
I don't think there can be any doubt about that. And it is interesting. I wonder with Trump too. I mean, he's also looking at this and saying, like, I don't really want to inherit this mess if I'm back in the White House either. But I'm sure the calculus for Bibi has always been, all right, let me just muddle through and get to a potential Donald Trump White House. And then I can really do whatever I want and face absolutely no even like hand-wringing or leaks to the press, et cetera. So I do wonder if that significantly changes his calculation if he sees, okay, even this guy who's supposed to be my guy, even he is ready for this to get wrapped up. So potentially a little bit of hope there. Go ahead, Ryan.
No, and the funny element there, the interpersonal element, Trump is still mad at Netanyahu for congratulating Biden on his victory.
Petty. So petty.
Like, Bibi didn't stop the steal, and so he's going to pay for it.
Stop it there. So Grimm is saying, hey, look, even if Trump is somewhat less awful on Israel as we believe based on his statements, part of the reason he might be telling Netanyahu, hey, I'm not going to be there for you all the way, you got to agree to this ceasefire deal, is because he's pissed off that Netanyahu didn't support him, Trump, when it's clear Trump had lost to Biden. And yeah, it's petty. That's how Trump is. But, in the end, I care about policy. So I welcome every politician's support for peace, for a ceasefire, for an end to the killing. Let's hear a little more, because Crystal Ball will get to the place where I really wanted her to get, which is addressing the Washington Post piece on the convention and the possibility that there could be dissension, rioting, some kind of disarray that's observed by the American people when looking at the Democratic convention.
For the rest of his life.
Yeah, I mean, incredible stuff. The funny thing about that op-ed that we put up from the Washington Post about the 1968 parallels, of which there truly are many, is, of course, the conclusion is that's why the protesters should back down. That's why the protesters shouldn't be pressing,
So, right. So this is exactly my point. Is King says Harris shouldn't let it happen, right? Colbert King says in the page of the Washington Post, candidate Harris can't let another 1968 happen. And yet, as I pointed out, and now as Crystal Ball's pointing out, he puts all the onus on the protesters, right? Not on Harris, on the protesters. That's the irony.
Biden or Harris, et cetera, instead of that's why Biden needs to push to get a ceasefire deal. That's why we need to bring this outrageous, immoral, genocide to a close and move beyond this. Instead, it's all on, these relatively powerless protesters who are objecting to the absolutely horrific images that they're seeing in their social media feeds every day. So perfect Washington Post ending there. One last.
All right, I'll stop it. Agree. That is the Washington Post. I pretty much agreed with everything she said, although she said she attributed the activists' behavior, the protests, the outrage to the images people are seeing in their TikTok and their social media. And I guess that's not untrue, but I think it minimizes the reality, which is genocide, which is the obvious effort by the state of Israel to eradicate Palestine completely. So it's not, the images are horrible, they activate a response, but what they ultimately represent is the policy of the state of Israel. And it's that horrific, it's that awful. All right, let's just get real quick, we'll go to, and I'd love to talk to you, 240-242-5646. Again, I don't have the ability right now. I guess I'm going to try to get up, see if there's any chat. I'm having a lot of trouble. For some reason, my chat isn't working right now like it should be. Sometimes that happens. So that's why I keep looking over to the side. I'm going to try to stop doing that. And again, click subscribe if you haven't yet. Just kind of, I haven't really, what is the word, operationalize the subscribe. I just, when I think about it, I tell people to subscribe. So that's kind of the way I do it here. I do hope you will. Obviously, the more subscribers, the better. The way we keep doing this and hopefully reach more people. Because really, it's just about having this voice, this pro-peace, this pro-worker voice, ultimately have some real influence and maybe be able to help make policy just a little better going forward. So here's from Jewish Insider, which is a very pro-Israel, very Zionist voice, but I do get their newsletter. I find it interesting anyway, and I thought it was very, very instructive the way they cover this story. about Columbia University, Manu Shafiq, abruptly resigns in aftermath of campus chaos. And of course, we saw the images of the protesters at Columbia, the camping out, the encampments, the taking over of the building, and ultimately Shafiq, showing no quarter, right? I mean, she was clearly on the side of the establishment, the elites, the pro-Israel forces, and not for the students. She called the police. She tried to get the police, the New York City police at first didn't want to get involved. Ultimately, she had more calls made. I guess she had some of the billionaire donors to Columbia call Eric Adams and push him. Shafiq was never against police presence on the campus. She never took the side of the protesters. She did everything she could to rein them in. I love this. So the headline is, it was anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activism, and that's what pushed her out. So they're blaming her, but they're blaming her from the right. She wasn't tough enough. She wasn't aggressive enough. They suspended professors who didn't toe the pro-Israel line. I don't know what more she could have done, but the narrative from the pro-Israel media in this country is that her failure in the end to completely suppress, to prevent any appearance of anti-Israel sentiment on campus, her failure to stomp that is what put her job, ultimately got her fired, put her job in line, ultimately discharged. And I mean, that's just not the case. I mean, it may be that the trustees were angry that Columbia looked bad, but she did everything she could for them. I don't know what else she could have done. She was absolutely on the side of Netanyahu and the pro-war, pro-Israel center and right. So according to Jewish Daily Insider, Columbia, like other American universities, saw an uptick in anti-Semitism and targeting of Zionist students, which they blame on Hamas, which is quite extraordinary. The Hamas attacks didn't lead to any uptick in anti-Semitism or targeting of Zionist students. If they even ever occurred, there might be some Zionist students who, some people, I don't even think they were targeted particularly. What caused the uptick in activism against Israel was Israel's violent, illegal retaliation against Palestine and their ongoing settlements, killing, wanton, indiscriminate killing, collective guilt attribution by Israel to all of Palestine for what Hamas did. That's why you saw activism on campus. It wasn't the Hamas attacks at all. It was Israel's horrific, atrocious response. And Shafiq, notwithstanding the claim that she somehow didn't do enough for the Jewish students, the Israeli students, did everything she could to shut down the protests. So again, media lying to you, media misrepresenting. It's really interesting because the Republicans are never going to be satisfied. They're always going to find some. Republicans hate any kind of elite education, elitism in education. I don't like the elitism, but look, I mean, these universities really are centers of a lot of really important research and humanity, work in the humanities and philosophy, as well as, of course, medicine, more prosaic disciplines. But the Republicans, I mean, she did everything they wanted, and they're still blaming her. Refusal to protect Jewish students. There were no Jewish students who were hurt. I mean, this is a complete lie by the Republican. Republicans are even worse. Although I'm sure you could find like Josh Gottheimer making some equally hideous statements. There were no Jewish students who were injured. Who did she fail to protect? It didn't happen. The epicenter for virulent anti-Semitism, there isn't. There's no virulent anti-Semitism. It hasn't been proven. Hasn't been demonstrated. There are no examples. This is an example-free argument. And again, they blame Hamas. Israel is responsible for any anti-Israeli sentiment. And of course, Virginia Fox, I don't know, is she Republican? Is she Democratic? Is she Jewish? I don't know. She's a disturbing wave of anti-Semitic harassment. All lies. It's all lies. And then ADL. ADL, Anti-Defamation League. To its credit, Anti-Defamation League, I guess they get a little credit for this. They don't attack Manouche because she did what they wanted. She cracked heads. She came down hard. She punished the protesters just like they wanted. So ADL isn't going to join the lynch mob to attack her for something she didn't do. They do blame the weight of anti-Semitism. We hear that a lot. Rise in anti-Semitism, people hate Jews, this, that, and the other thing. It is all driven by, those claims are ultimately driven by, and the source for them, if there ever is a source, which there usually is, to the extent that there's a source, the quotes are always from the anti-defamation. Reported here before that the ADL is not credible. The ADL lies. The Wikipedia has said, you know what, we're not going to use the ADL as a source anymore, which so many media does. Time, USA Today, Washington Post, New York Times. They'll say, oh yeah, there's been a rise in anti-Semitism, and then they quote ADL. So here's Jewish Currents. June 17, Jonah Ben Avraham, Shane Burley. Jewish Currents. A line-by-line reassessment of ADL's data illuminates the flaws in its methodology. You can't believe a word they say. And they're very, very specific, which I love. Unlike ADL, which is often very vague, or unlike the Republicans who talk about the rise in anti-Semitism, unlike Jewish Insider, which talks about the rise in anti-Semitism, completely evidence-free, completely example-free. Unlike those sources, Jewish Currents is very, very clear about how ADL is full of crap. More than 1,000 examples were misclassified as anti-Semitic because and this is something I've talked about quite a bit on this program, because ADL classified speech critical of Israel or critical of Zionism as anti-Semitic. Not anti-Semitic. There are plenty of Jews who are critical of anti-Semitism and critical of Zionism. There aren't Zionists that attack Zionism. They're not anti-Semitic. They don't agree with that train of reasoning, that thought process, that logic. They think it's wrong. They think it's misguided. They think it's led to killing, indiscriminate, wanton, racist killing, and they're right. And it's not just the mischaracterization either that Jewish Currents points to when proving that ADL is not reliable, that ADL is not credible when it talks about rising anti-Semitism in this country. They don't just say, hey, you said this was anti-Semitic, but it wasn't. It was critical of Israel. But guess what else Jewish Currents found? Other examples, there's no real evidence to support it. There's no imagery. There's no time, date, place. This is what happened. They just say, oh, yeah, maybe in like Iowa, we've seen increasing reports that their students are being targeted. And that's it. There's not enough information. So 2 ways the ADL is completely full of crap. One, they simply lie. They say, if you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic. So those are bogus examples. Or they say, well, this was anti-Semitic, but no one can judge. No one knows what they're even talking about. Greatly exaggerating, overstating the extent of anti-Semitism. I'm sure there's some in this country, but if you want to stop hate, then you gotta fight for, against injustice. You gotta fight against inequality. You gotta fight against wealth and income disparities that are, off the charts, because that just pisses people off. It makes them resentful. It makes them bitter. And they may or may not choose the right targets for their anger. All right, I was going to talk about Ukraine, but you know what? Tomorrow's a free-for-all. I've gone over an hour. So we'll hit Ukraine tomorrow. And there'll be more information, too, that hopefully will inform me. And then thence, perhaps I can inform you. Have a great afternoon if you're on the East Coast, or the rest of your morning if you're not. And I will be back tomorrow.